What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Tomatolito Boxing Show. I'm Hikali, and today's episode is going to be a fun one. I hope you enjoy it. I put together a list of fights that I would like to see, hopefully, this year. So this episode is going to be 24 fights, 24 dream fights for 2024. If you want to go ahead and pause the episode and put your list together, and then we could go ahead and you could follow along as I'm reading off my list. We could see how many fights we end up getting in common. You could go ahead and do that. Pause the episode, go put your list together, and then come right back. I'm really curious to hear what you think of this list. I held myself to certain parameters, and it took me a little bit to put it together. Not too long, but it took me a little bit to put it together because I got rid of some fights. I held myself to certain account as to not repeating fighters on this list. Every one of the fights had to have some type of repercussion or some type of meaning behind it, whether it was by way of standings or rankings, title contention, or a title on the line. Something had to be on the line for these fights to make sense. And so those are it. Also, I didn't go into the dream realm like most do as to who would have won between Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali, or none of that. This is a real one. This is a real list. You're going to recognize these fighters, active fighters of today, and fighters that we continuously talk about. So 24 fights, no repeats. So you have 48 fighters on here. Of course, some of the common ones, or some of the fights that the boxing world is clamoring for, well, they're going to be near the top of the list because those are the ones that we want to see, and you very well know which ones I'm talking about. But no, you're not going to see, this is not going to be a list of an unrealistic one where it's a clickbaity one or a clout one or a biased one where they're going to be like, I want to see Terrence Crawford against Anthony Joshua, and I want to see Terrence Crawford against Canelo, and none of that. Not the same fighter pinning them against the entire world. I hope you enjoy the list. I really put some work into this, and I think they're like I said, they're meaningful fights. And so without further ado, let's get into it. 24 dream fights for 2024. And the first one's a little bit of a stretch. We're going to kick off with number 24. Not so much of a dream fight, but this one's more about if you talk about it, be about it type fight. And at number 24, I ended up listing Jake Paul versus Ellis Zorro. A lot of you may be upset already, but don't check out yet. The reason I'm putting Jake Paul here is because exactly what I said. It's not a dream fight. And why would I put him against Ellis Zorro? Well, if you recall who Ellis Zorro was, he just recently got knocked out at the hands of Jai Opetaia. Cruiserweight, Jake Paul seems to be competing at the cruiserweight division. Now, this is a reason why I thought about this fight, and initially I wasn't going to put Jake Paul on here because everybody seems to be undecided, and I ended up actually putting an episode together recapping Jake Paul's recent victory over Andre August just a few episodes ago. So if you haven't checked that one out, go check it out, see what you think, because I'm on the fence as to where Jake Paul, or my opinion of Jake Paul, whether it's for real or whether it's not, if this is all just a big sham, but he seems to be talking the talk. He seems to be putting in the work. He's doing good things for the sport of boxing as far as promotion goes, and doing the right thing by his fighters, the few fighters that he has under his banner, MVP. So he seems to be doing the right things, saying the right things, and he seems to be putting the work and focusing solely on the sport of boxing. If that's the case, this is why I'm listing this fight, because he needs to get away from selling to us that this is the most experienced fighter. He is he's a great boxer with good boxing pedigree, as he did trying to sell the Andre August fight. But he was a fighter that nobody really knew about, nobody had heard about, not a contender, not a prospect, not even in the top 100. Just a fighter who's getting getting into his own, pretty inactive at that. And so he sold it, and I don't know how the numbers turned out for his event, but I can't imagine that they were super great. Now, Elizoro, to me, would be the perfect opponent for him. One, because he's coming off of a knockout loss, but remember, he was undefeated until the point where Jayo Pitaya just discarded him in one round. He knocked him out in nasty fashion in the first round. But Elizoro, by most sanctioning bodies, and including if you want to go to like BoxRec, or you want to look at how most of the sanctioning bodies or the division is being ranked, Elizoro is pretty much in the top 30 on common grounds across the board. So if he's at top 30, and just looking at BoxRec, if he's number 30, as of the last time that I checked out BoxRec and where Elizoro set, that would be an ideal fight for Jake Paul to really prove that he's serious, that he's really serious about the sport and about starting to climb up the ladder, that he's serious on the path towards title contention. And if you recall, a couple fights ago when he fought Tommy Fury, Mauricio Suleiman from the WBC said that he would highly consider ranking Jake Paul within the top 10 or top 20, including start lining him up for a potential title should he be victorious against Tommy Fury. So this is coming out of the Mauricio Suleiman mouth, who is the president of the WBC. So if those considerations are already there against subpar competition, Tommy Fury, by the way, needs to get into, he's not on the list, but he needs to get into some serious contention as well himself, and get away from the influencer boxing and all that entertainment stuff if he really wants to follow in the path of Tyson Fury and his family. Jake Paul, Elizoro, to me, sits at number 24. I think it would be a great comeback fight for Elizoro, who has decent boxing pedigree, and he would be a perfect test against a Jake Paul who's climbing up the ranks, or at least who is wanting to climb up the ranks. And it would be a perfect test for him to come back against a fairly inexperienced fighter, but one who seems to be gaining traction each and every single time that he steps into the ring. And for Jake Paul, this will legitimize his resume, because there's no longer opponents of that are past their peak and that were or will be legends of other art forms. This would be an active, legit contender, and it would legitimize his standing in the sport of boxing and in that cruiserweight division today. So that's the fight that sits at number 24, Jake Paul versus Elizoro. I'm interested to hear what you think. Let's move on to number 23. I put Naoya Inoue, the monster, versus Brandon Figueroa. And the reason I put that was we just witnessed Inoue beat Tapales, stop Tapales, and become undisputed 377 days apart for a second time. He did it at 118. And now he did it in two fights in 2020 or at 122 this past December in 2023. So Inoue is undisputed for a second time. He did mention post-fight that he wanted to stay at the 122 division. And it looks like he's in negotiations to fight Panterita Neri, Luis Neri. That fight also happening out in Japan. Now, again, this is a dream list, right? Brandon Figueroa, if you remember, he ended up having that back and forth crazy fight with Cool Boy Steph, with Stephen Fulton. And that's where Stephen Fulton ended up lifting, or who Stephen Fulton lifted the second title to become unified at 122. He got it by beating Brandon Figueroa. That rematch was supposed to be in the works, but Brandon Figueroa couldn't make weight anymore and dropped down to 122, so he's campaigning at 126. If Naoya Inoue was to delve into the 126 just to test the waters, this would be an ideal opponent. A taller, lankier fighter who is going to bring the fight to him, and who gave Cool Boy Steph a hell of a fight, who was a who's who at 122, and he's in line to be one of the top dogs at 126. This would be an ideal matchup for Naoya Inoue, and it would be a fun back and forth fight where Brandon Figueroa, I think, would really take the fight to Naoya Inoue, which would be potentially a detriment to him because Inoue is so quick at countering and at getting out of the way. Plus, he possesses power. So it would be a really, really fun fight. Remember that Brandon Figueroa was just running straight through Stephen Fulton's punches, trying to keep him and maintain him on the ropes as much as he could during that fight. And it was just a back and forth fight where Steph Fulton was just countering with uppercuts and hooks on the inside. And Figueroa was just there to be hit, but continued to walk through Fulton's punches and land and inflict damage on Fulton at that. So I think that would be the ideal opponent for Inoue to test the waters and introduce himself into 126 if that ends up happening. So the monster against Brandon Figueroa, that sits at number 23 on my list. At number 22, Chris Eubanks Jr. versus Erislandy Lara. Why am I even putting him on the list? A lot of people are not big fans of Chris Eubanks Jr. But I kind of like Chris Eubanks Jr. I'm not going to lie. I like what he stands for. I like the way he carries himself. He's got the swag. Years ago, I didn't take him serious until that whole Conor Benn thing happened with the drug testing and the fight fell through and so forth. He speaks his mind and he seems to be very truthful. He doesn't compromise himself much. He's not the most talented of fighters. He's definitely not his dad. But he looked good in his rematch against Liam Smith. And he seems to be very coachable. He seems to be very, especially because he had Bomac in his corner. In his last fight with Smith, he left Roy Jones and moved over to Bomac. And he came away with a victory where he looked good. He boxed good. He boxed well. I think Erislandy Lara, who's on the latter stages of his career and potentially maybe a few fights away from hanging up his gloves, he still seems to have the WBA title around his waist. He got elevated to full champion at 160 after Gennady Golovkin vacated his title. And this would be the way for Chris Eubanks to get, because he's younger than Lara, this would be a perfect fight for him to prove that he belongs near the top echelon. Obviously, Erislandy Lara is a little bit older, but he could still pop and he could still possess a lot of obstacles for Chris Eubanks Jr. If he fails a test against Lara, well, we'll basically just take what we can from Chris Eubanks at that point and know that he's not going to be near the peak. But if he's gonna make the leap, he's at that point, at that crossroads in his career where he needs to take on meaningful fights and forget about Conor Benn, forget about all these money, just go after a title, get yourself around a title. And because he's campaigning at 160, this would be the ideal fight. Then you could go ahead and pursue a Jermall Charlo fight, which would be a good payday for both. And it would be a very marketable fight, but get yourself a title first. And I think this would be his way to find success at 160. I think that would be an ideal fight for both. For Erislandy Lara, well, he's got plenty of names in his resume. He's done it all in the sport of boxing, but he's fairly inactive. Getting a Chris Eubanks would not just mean a big payday for him. If he was able to be successful, it would be a big payday and a decent name in his resume, defend the title, and if he decides to hang it up or get another big fight down the line, maybe he could with a Jermall and just close his career with big paydays and big purses. And I think this would be a decent purse for both of them. And it would be a very interesting fight because I think Erislandy Lara is very tricky for Chris Eubanks to be able to figure him out. But if Eubanks sticks with Bomac, I think he would possess the style and the necessary attributes to be able to defeat an older Erislandy Lara and get a title around his waist. Because he's at that point right now in his career. So that sits at number 22. At number 21, the man who we just witnessed make his long-awaited comeback this past Saturday, Vergil Ortiz. After 17 months, he came back. He's successful. Now, for me, Vergil Ortiz would be an ideal opponent. Maybe some of you are going to be upset that I have him so low on the list, but he's got a lot to prove still, and sky's the limit for him. For this year, if he says that if he doesn't get the big names, as he said post-fight, if he doesn't get the big names, then oh well, there's plenty more boxers, and he's just going to continue to stay active and continue fighting. If the fight with Tim Tszyu doesn't materialize, which as of right now it was a little bit of banter back and forth on X. If he doesn't get the Terrence Crawford, which I don't think will be likely, if he doesn't get any other big name, I think Conor Benn would be the ideal opponent for him. Conor Benn's going to be active later this month. He's going to make his debut out in Vegas. Sorry, not later this month, but at the beginning of February. And he's going to make his debut in Vegas against a lesser-known opponent. I think Conor Benn and Vergil Ortiz would be an all-action fight, and we would see what Conor Benn has. He was tested by the Mexican fighter that he faced out in Florida not that long ago, a few months back. I think it was in October when he fought, maybe early November. And he was tested quite a bit by that fighter, and he didn't look at his absolute best. But he was also inactive for quite a while. Remember, because of the allegations and the positive testing and the back and forth with the sanctioning bodies, with the English sanctioning body or the British board of boxing, and he set out. He was away from the ring, so ring rust was definitely something that was on full display for Conor Benn in that fight. Nonetheless, he came away with his hand raised. He got the win, and I think this fight would be a meaningful fight for both of them. One of the two would end up surpassing. I slightly favor Vergil Ortiz, maybe a little biased, but I think Vergil Ortiz would have the necessary boxing to beat a Conor Benn, a young Conor Benn, but both of them seem to be near the similar stages of their career, and I think this would be a full-on firefight between the two. Power versus power, speed versus speed. I think boxing pedigree would be the difference maker in this one, and I think it slightly favors the Vergil Ortiz as the higher level boxer of the two. It would be a fun fight, Vergil Ortiz, Conor Benn, in my opinion. So that fight sits at 21. At number 20, I have Ryan Garcia. Ryan Garcia against Jose Ramirez. Jose Ramirez is the new assignee for Golden Boy. He has left Top Rank. He is now with Golden Boy Promotions. So that would be a fairly easy fight for Golden Boy to make if they're not able to secure Ryan Garcia against Rolly. Now that he is back to revisiting the Rolly negotiations and has abandoned or walked away momentarily from the Devin Haney negotiations. If neither ends up happening for Ryan Garcia, what better way than Jose Ramirez, who is the new assignee and by far one of the bigger names that Ryan Garcia would have faced or needs to face, not just at 140, but at this stage of his career. Jose Ramirez would be a solid opponent for him. And it would be a real 140-pound test for Ryan Garcia if he is going to be a legitimate fighter at 140 who is willing to take on all comers. If he doesn't get those big money fights, which also have title implications there, I think a Jose Ramirez will legitimize his resume. It will legitimize his stance in the 140-pound division, just like Teofimo defeated the man who was the man, Josh Taylor, at 140 pounds, who became the man by defeating this very man that we're mentioning, Jose Ramirez. That was the big unification bout where all titles were on the line. Josh Taylor came out successful, stopped Ramirez, and Ramirez has been fairly inactive. So if Ryan Garcia is going to legitimize his resume and take on a real opponent and one of the faces or former faces of that division, who is still a very real threat, in my opinion, this would be the perfect opponent for him. And now that Ramirez sits with Golden Boy, how easy would that be for them to make? Is it realistic? I don't know. I think it is. But if not, we may let's say Ryan Garcia does go on to fight Rolly Romero. Then I think the other fight that would be fairly easy to make would be Jose Ramirez and Arnold Barboza Jr., who is now also with Golden Boy, and that would be a great fight for both of them. and a real test for Arnold Barbosa and a real test for Jose Ramirez. I think the Ryan Garcia, Jose Ramirez would be a perfect style, a blend of the up-and-coming fighter, the new era fighter versus the veteran fighter in Ramirez. So that would be a fun fight. That sits at number 20. Number 19, we move over to women's boxing, and I have Alicia Baumgartner versus Claressa Shields. How likely is this fight to happen? It's not that far-fetched. If you think about it, if you've been following it, these two women have been going back and forth on social media. It all started with Baumgartner making a comment, and now it went from friendly banter to the commentary between the two getting more animated, to now there being some real disdain and animosity between the two. What separates these two from getting in the ring is that Claressa Shields is the bigger fighter, campaigns at a way heavier division than Alicia Baumgartner. Claressa Shields has gone from welterweight to super welterweight to middleweight to even as high as super middleweight, whereas Alicia Baumgartner is the undisputed champ of the 130-pound division, which she successfully accomplished after defeating Michaela Mayer. Michaela Mayer has since moved up in weight and will be challenging Natasha Jonas for her welterweight title. So she went from 130 all the way to 147. Alicia Baumgartner would be a fairly good test for Claressa Shields. Boxing-wise, I think both of them have really good boxing pedigree. They both have similar speed. I think Claressa Shields would definitely, the power would favor her, and the body size. In height, very similar height for both of them. So there wouldn't be a big advantage for either there, but the weight would be a bigger advantage for Claressa Shields as she obviously steps into the ring and campaigns at heavier weights, meaning she is accustomed to taking heavier punching power and delivers heavier punching power than that of Alicia Baumgartner. So that would be a fun fight. The fact that they're going back and forth at each other, it would be like a crossover type fight between weight divisions, but it would just be a good, entertaining fight. And the more they continue to go back and forth with each other, the more marketable the fight's becoming. So I think that would be a fun fight. And if it happens this year, hopefully like around summer, if they're able to make it, it would be an ideal fight. Remember, Claressa Shields is diving or messing around between boxing and the PFL because she has a contract there. So she's going back and forth from MMA and boxing, whereas Alicia Baumgartner is going to get back into the ring and continue campaigning at 130 as far as we know right now. But she has called out Katie Taylor. She has called out Chantel Cameron and looking to fight just the best out there, including has called out Amanda Serrano, willing to take on Amanda Serrano. She's willing to move up to 130 and put her titles on the line. So Alicia Baumgartner just wants to fight and wants the biggest fights out there. And what better than to go against the self-proclaimed GOAT and arguably someone who may very well go down in her career as the GOAT of women's boxing in Claressa Shields. So that fight sits at number 19. At number 18, Frank Sanchez against Big Baby Jared Anderson. The 16-0 Toledo, Ohio native Jared Anderson is just running through opponents. His opposition continues to get better. The matchmakers are doing really well by Jared Anderson and bringing him up in such a good manner that Jared Anderson continues to get slightly tested and then passes the test with flying colors. His last opponent was Rudenko, and that was, I believe, in August of 2023, and since he's been inactive. Frank Sanchez, we just witnessed him at the Day of Reckoning, and he was the one that, if you recall that episode, I mentioned that to me he was the one whose stock was going to rise the highest if he ended up coming out with a successful victory and a big bang of a victory at that, if he managed to stop the taller, heavier, bigger fighter overall in Junior Fa. And he did. He knocked out Junior Fa. He stopped him, the smaller fighter, but really good boxing and really good power on behalf of Frank Sanchez. Fast delivery, and he managed to stop the bigger fighter, meaning He's there. He's knocking on everybody's door, and he needs these big fights. 24-0 versus 16-0. This fight would be an ideal fight to make because they're both right at the moment right now. Jared Anderson he's basically reaching his peak. And he has been very vocal in stating that he doesn't really care about titles. He doesn't really care about the drama between the sanctioning bodies and all that. He just wants the biggest fights and the biggest paydays and wants to make the most money. He's very vocal and very straightforward about that. This would be a huge fight for both of them, especially if Canelo gets behind this fight, because he is one of the he's one of the fighters that has been backing Frank Sanchez since he began fighting stateside and is trained by Eddie Reynoso. This would be a big money fight, in my opinion, and it could very well be a headlining event or a co-main event to a big Canelo fight. And I'm sure Bob Arum would be willing to make this fight. So Frank Sanchez and Jared Big Baby Anderson. If you don't know who Jared Anderson is yet, man, I mean, he's put on some great performances for Bob Arum and Top Rank. And he's a fighter that you need to familiarize yourself with in the heavyweight division. Jared Anderson, Frank Sanchez would be an all-out assault from any level that you look at this. As far as a heavyweight fight, it would be an awesome fight, one that could very well be overlooked because everybody's so focused on Fury and Usyk and Joshua and what Wilder's going to do and Andy Ruiz if he comes back. But this fight right here would be fireworks. Jared Anderson and Frank Sanchez. So they sit at number 18 in my list. Number 17, we move down to the super middleweights. David Morrell, Osles Iglesias, two Cuban fighters, Cuban pedigree fighters. Osles Iglesias, a Cuban fighter who is fighting out of Germany at the moment, but still represents Cuba. 9-0 versus David Morrell, 10-0, who just got his 10th victory not that long ago. This would be an awesome tactical chess match of a fight. Both fighters in similar positions in their current careers. Osles Iglesias sits with the IBO, who is the lesser of the sanctioning bodies, the lesser known, I should say, of the sanctioning bodies. Nonetheless, the IBO carries some weight and has been held by some of the biggest names in the sport of boxing, like a Manny Pacquiao, like Anthony Joshua, Alexander Usyk, Triple G. You name it. The IBO has been around the waist of some of the biggest names. The IBO title, that is, has been around the waist of some of the biggest names that you could think of in the sport of boxing. And Osles Iglesias holds the IBO title at 168. 9-0 fighter. Both of them with Cuban pedigree styles. Both big punchers. This would be an awesome fight. Both of them in similar stages of their career. And it would catapult the winner of this fight to new levels and bigger fights. A lot of people don't know who Osles Iglesias is. You would after this fight. And for David Morrell, I mean, not only would he show that he's able to contend with the difficult style that is the Cuban style of boxing, the Cuban pedigree, but he would be taking a step up. And another former champ, or another, another fellow champion who campaigns in the same division. Why not? If you don't get David Benavidez, take on Osles Iglesias. Why not? Lift another one of the, even though it's a lesser known title, you'll come away with another title. Now you'll have the WBA and IBO. Your rankings will skyrocket. You'll garner the attention of all the sanctioning bodies even more so, and then begin to continue to pursue a David Benavidez or cement yourself as the who's who of 168 and begin calling for the Caleb Plants and the bigger names at 168. Doesn't get any bigger than Benavidez and Canelo at 168, but you do have your Plants, you have your Durrells, you have so forth. I think this is the fight that you need to take if you're David Morrell for the doors to open wide for him. So that fight sits at number 17, David Morrell against Osles Iglesias, a 168 showdown. Number 16, Andy Ruiz and Zhilei Zhang. Zhang just coming off the 2 stoppage victories over the juggernaut Joe Joyce. Andy Ruiz recovering from shoulder surgery, still been inactive. He's been inactive for quite a while. Did not take part in the Day of Reckoning. Did not end up fighting Deontay Wilder, as was the speculated fight for the majority of 2023. He's been out for quite a while, but this would be a true test for both fighters because Zhilei Zhang is the more flat-footed of the 2 fighters, but possesses a lot of power. Andy Ruiz possesses good footwork, good hand speed, and possesses good pop as well. This would be an ideal fight. He's held his own against bigger punchers in the past in the form of Anthony Joshua and Luis Ortiz. Zhang ended up getting a controversial loss, one that he wants to avenge against Filip Hrgovic, and stop Joe Joyce in subsequent fights. This would be the perfect fight to make, and a perfect blend of styles, a perfect contrast of styles at that. I think contrast would be the best word for that to describe this fight. Andy Ruiz, Zhilei Zhang would be an all-out awesome heavyweight fight, and maybe they'll decide to do a Day of Reckoning 2 in Saudi Arabia, and they could end up having Frank Sanchez and Jared Anderson on that same card. Why not? Because the very next one that I got for you is another heavyweight showdown at number 15. I put Deontay Wilder against Joe Joyce, who we were just mentioning. Why? Why not? 2 big, tall fighters, big punchers. Joe Joyce coming off of back-to-back losses to Zhilei Zhang. Deontay Wilder coming off of his recent loss against Joseph Parker. Both of them are at the crossroads stages of their careers. Deontay Wilder doesn't know if he wants to continue. Joe Joyce coming off of damaging fights against Zhilei Zhang. 2 fights where he incurred a lot of damage. So those 2 fights alone very well took years out of Joe Joyce's career, in my opinion. This would not just be a big payday for both fighters, but it would definitely be one of the bigger paydays and one of the bigger purses for Joe Joyce in his respective career. And it would be an ideal fight where if Deontay Wilder gets back to work and shows the version of Deontay Wilder that we witnessed against Luis Ortiz or even against Tyson Fury. If we see a version of that Deontay Wilder versus this version that we just witnessed, which was a no-show, in my opinion, against Joseph Parker, if we get just some work from Deontay Wilder rather than just sitting and waiting and attempting to land his power punch, his right hand, his right missile, that's all he threw. If he actually tries to start jabbing and moving and creating a punch, generating his attack, I think it'll be a really fun fight because he's got the reach and he's got the strength to break Joe Joyce's guard. Just like Zhang did. Zhang was punching from a distance, down center, and hurting Joe Joyce. Joe Joyce coming off damage, fighting another big banger like this would either be a huge successful test for him should he defeat Deontay Wilder, and a huge confidence booster that he could handle the power punchers and that he's back on his winning ways and that he's not scared of the knockout artists. Huge confidence booster for him should he be successful against Wilder. Wilder, same exact results. If he beats Joe Joyce, his confidence would skyrocket through the roof and he would be back clamoring for the Anthony Joshua or calling out for the Anthony Joshua fight or whoever may be at the top at that time, or maybe even fight an Andy Ruiz. This would be a perfect crossroads fight for me, and I'd like to know what you think about it. Maybe another Day of Reckoning 2, and then we could have all these heavyweight fights take part in it. That's it to number 15, Deontay Wilder against Joe Joyce. Let me know what you think of that one. Number 14, Shakur Stevenson against Vasily Lomachenko. I think this is one of those fights where, similar to what I mentioned with Ryan Garcia, Jose Ramirez earlier in the show, the young fighter against the old veteran who still possesses and poses a huge threat to the entire lightweight division and could pose problems to anybody. Supposedly, the Lomachenko-George Kambosos negotiations have been ongoing. Who knows if that fight's going to happen, but I really think that a Shakur Stevenson passing of the torch type fight against Lomachenko is necessary. And for Lomachenko, should he be successful against Shakur Stevenson, what a huge statement that would be for him. And it's very likely that he would do so. This would be as high-level chess as you could get. Potentially the highest strategic fight out of this entire list that I'm going to read to you. It would be tit for tat, punch for punch, who dodged this, who got hit there, you move right, I hit left, and a back and forth strategic mental warfare of a boxing match that this would be between Lomachenko and Shakur Stevenson. Yes, Shakur didn't look too great in his last fight, but he's on and off. And the talks are that there was an injury potentially present during the fight, but he didn't want to pull out. Whether you believe that or not, I don't know. But give him the benefit of the doubt because he's put on some amazing performances. Some shockers at that. The way he stopped Oscar Valdez. The way he looks, and then he takes an off fight, and then he comes back and puts on back-to-back amazing performances. He's just a fun fighter to watch who continues to grow into his own and come into his own and has the WBC title, one of the former titles that Vasily Lomachenko used to hold. That would be a perfect fight for me to make, and it should be an easy one because they're both top-rank fighters. Shakur and Lomachenko maybe should be higher on the list, but I think it sits perfectly at number 14 for me as we continue to proceed forward. I really want to know what you think about this fight. Overall, the whole list. So whenever you see me post the episode up on Instagram, and you're able to link through my Instagram account over to the podcast, to these episodes, that's where I want to see your comments on the Instagram page. So make sure you share it with your friends, that you talk to your friends, your loved ones, your family members, so we could continue to grow this show. And that's where I want to hear from you. Either there, X, I'm not really on unless the times that you'll find me on is when there's a live fight going on. So if there's a fight that you're watching, more than likely you'll find me there. So just look me up on X at Toma Todito Show and shoot me a message, and we'll start a chat. We'll start talking about how the fight's going. On Instagram, you could definitely leave your comments as soon as you see me post an episode, then you know it's live on whichever your favorite podcast platform is that you listen to the show on. And that's where you can leave me the comments right there. Let's talk about these things. Let's talk about this list. There's a lot to talk about so far, and we're at number 14 right now. Let's get back to it. Number 13, Emmanuel Navarrete, Vaquero Navarrete versus Joe Cordina. I think this would be an ideal fight at 130 pounds. We just saw Navarrete go back and forth against Robson Conceição, and it looks like they may be shooting for a rematch on that one because it was that close of a fight. A huge back and forth show between the two. All heart, all spirit, and it was a fun back and forth firework type of fight where they hit each other with everything they had. Robson wanted that title. He wants a title around his waist and is willing to do anything and put his body through no limit, no limitations for what Conceição is willing to do to become a champion. And for Navarrete, he's defending that title with everything he's got. He incurred a lot of damage and continued to walk forward. It was a hell of a fight, and he retained his title at the end of it. If I remember correctly, I think it was called a draw, so I think that's the fight that they're going to be shooting for. But if he doesn't go and work out that rematch with Robson Conceição, Joe Cordina for Navarrete, his marketability and his stock would rise even more if he travels abroad, crosses the pond, and go faces Joe Cordina in his home. Imagine how big of a fight that would be, what a big crowd it would attract, and you would have a Mexico versus UK type war. It would be an awesome, awesome show, an awesome scene, and it would be title versus title at 130 pounds. Ideal fight. And that one excites me a lot, and that's why it sits at number 13 and so high on this list. From there, we go to number 12, and I have one of the recent shockers and the fight that should have won the fight of the year. I don't know if it did, but it should have become the fight of the year. It happened very late in the year, and that was between Rafael Divino, El Divino Espinosa, versus Rey Vargas. Divino lifted the title from Robeisy Ramirez at 126. And Rey Vargas is one of the other champions, the WBC champ at 126. Mexico versus Mexico showdown. Divino versus Rey Vargas, I think, is a very even fight. Rey Vargas, a little more experience, more ring generalship, probably a better resume, veteran of the sport. Whereas Divino pulled off a shock of a win, lifting that title from Robeisy Ramirez. Of course, Ramirez is going to want, El Tren's going to want that title. But remember, the talks were this was a stay busy fight for Robeisy, as he was looking to potentially attract Naoya Inoue from 122 to 126. Being that Robeisy had already gone to Japan and fight on the undercard of a Naoya Inoue when Inoue defeated Steph Fulton earlier in 2023. So Robeisy loses the title. Divino pulls off an amazing victory and puts on a hell of a showing. Becomes a champion at 126 to close out 2023. It was a hell of a fight where he got dropped, and it looks like El Tren was en route to coming off with another stoppage win. And then the Mexican heart and the Mexican warrior in Divino Espinosa came out, and somehow he ends up fighting all the way to the end and drops Ramirez down the stretch. Him against Rey Vargas, two tall, lanky fighters with long reach, good punching power. It would be a very odd type fight, but a punch could change the entire outcome. And now we know that that's very true for Divino Espinosa. One punch could change the trajectory of the fight for him, and he's that type of fighter. He became an all-action fighter, and Rey Vargas against Divino Espinosa would be a perfect Mexican showdown to set up for 126 in a big unification title fight. So that fight for me sits at number 12. At number 11, one division north, I would love to see Oscar Valdez challenge the WBC champ in Oshaki Foster. A lot of people don't know much about Oshaki Foster, but he has been a hell of a fighter. I've been following his career for the last 3-4 years. He's a fighter who has prior experience in facing Haney and Shakur and Gervonta, has animosity with Gervonta Davis and has a past with them. They've gone back and forth on social media. But of course, Oshaki Foster was the lesser known of that crew. He ended up getting in some personal troubles, which delayed his career. But since he's been fully dedicated to boxing, he's been on a uphill trajectory and now sits as a WBC champ at 130 pounds. He's a hell of a boxer with good hand speed, very strategic. And an Oscar Valdez fight with Oshaki Foster, I think, would be as fan-friendly of a fight as you could ever ask for. Oshaki Foster is fast. He would pose all kinds of trouble for Oscar Valdez. Maybe not to the level of what we saw Shakur Stevenson do to Oscar Valdez, but Oshaki would definitely be looking to pick Oscar Valdez apart. Oscar would have to, with the experience that he gained from the Shakur fight, he would have to really make this into a boxing fight rather than always seeking the heavy punch and pressuring Oshaki Foster. He would have to make this into an old school boxing fight and mix it up. Because Oshaki stays boxing and counters you well. He will box you in the center of the ring and will counter you when you press in. Oscar Valdez would need to find the perfect blend of his style of when to go in and when to box, and it would be a fun strategic fight, in my opinion. This one does sit higher. Obviously, Shakur and Vasily Lomachenko, many of you may be like, what the hell? That should be one of the top fights. It is. I mean, this is not that very big of a list, but Vasily Lomachenko is an older fighter, and Shakur Stevenson, that's one of those passing the torch fights, and maybe you're right. Maybe I should have put it a little bit higher, but I felt that it is set right at number 14. Oscar Valdez is still, he's not past his prime. He's right there near the peak of his career, and he's a couple fights, 1 or 2 fights from starting the descension, the downslope of his career, but he's still right there as one of the top dogs, in my opinion. And I think a fight with Oshaki Foster would not just be a big fan-friendly fight, especially if they do it in a decent arena. Maybe not a Vegas, but if they go to LA or they go somewhere in Arizona, it would be a very marketable, very sellable fight, and it would be a fun fight to watch because the styles would be perfectly set up against one another. Oshaki Foster, if you don't know much about him, he's your WBC champ at 130 pounds. Go look into him. There's plenty of film to do research on Oshaki Foster and to enjoy. He's a hell of a fighter. I really like Oshaki Foster and what he brings to the table. At number 10, we return to women's boxing, and I have Seniesa Estrada, super bad, versus Yokasta Valle. If you haven't been following this, the animosity between these two is as real as it gets. From Seniesa being with Golden Boy to Yokasta Valle being with another promoter. That fight never happened. Yokasta Valle then gets signed by Golden Boy, while Seniesa's having back and forth with Golden Boy, leaves Golden Boy and goes over to Top Rank. Valle comes to Golden Boy, and they basically switch spots and switch promoters. Now, Yokasta Valle has been going back and forth with Seniesa on social media and during the post-fights and interviews and so forth. And this is a fight that's going to be its own main event when it does get made. And I really, really believe it'll get made this year. Seniesa Estrada is a force to be reckoned with, and she still holds the record for the fastest knockout, sitting at 7 seconds, if I remember correctly. I actually did an episode on that, on the fastest knockout, sitting at 7 seconds in a professional fight. And Seniesa Estrada holds that record. I did an episode early in my catalog. You could go ahead and do research on that, because that was one of the fun episodes that I put together. I don't remember if it was 2021 or maybe 2020. I don't remember. I think it was 2021 when I put that together. But you could go check that out. It's one of the oldies but goodies from my catalog. Seniesa Estrada, Yokasta Valle. I think Yokasta Valle is the bigger of the two fighters, possibly the stronger of the two fighters, but they possess very similar boxing styles, and it would be a fun fight. I think Seniesa holds the speed a little bit more, but both of them get hit a lot. Both of them get hit, and they're fairly open. They're fairly easy to get hit, and it would be a matter of who's gonna outsmart who and who's gonna withstand whose damage. I think Seniesa is the smaller of the two fighters for sure, but I think she possesses good pop and fast hands. I think the speed would make the difference in this one, whereas for Yokasta, I would favor her power, her punching power over Seniesa, and her size. She's a little bit bigger of a fighter than Seniesa is. So that sits at number 10, and now let's break into the top 10. So here we go. Let's catch our breath. Let's get down to the nitty gritty. At number 9, Jai Opetaia, who we just recently witnessed knock out the fighter who I have sitting at the bottom of this list at Elizoro at number 24. Jai Opetaia, he is the man at cruiserweight, in my opinion. He is definitely the person who should be holding all the titles. And I think he's just a couple fights away from completing that feat should he decide to do so. He's very vocal about how he doesn't like the way that the boxing business is ran. He doesn't like the sanctioning bodies getting in the way of making certain fights or not allowing certain fights to come to fruition. So he doesn't like that. He's very critical of that. He's very vocal about it, and rightfully so, because he just wants to fight. He wants to make good purses and put on good fights for his fans, and he doesn't like all those obstacles and all the muddy waters that he has to thread through, because he just wants to fight. He wants to get in the ring and be active. So he's a fan's fighter. He's willing to drop titles if he has to for the sake of letting the fight proceed. And that's something that we witnessed take place in the lead up to the Day of Reckoning, which he took a part of. Jayo Pitaya versus Chris Billam Smith, the UK fighter who is the young up-and-coming prospect, contender, champion, biggest named UK side in the cruiserweight division. I think Chris Billam Smith and Jayo Pitaya is very likely to happen this year, maybe towards the summertime. But I think that's the best fight to make at cruiserweight at the current moment. And Chris Billam Smith is probably your new age Marius Braillis. That's possibly the best way I could describe it. Chris Billam Smith is just one or two fights away, big names, should he get big names in his resume, and this would be one of them, Jayo Pitaya. If he's able to get a big name like Jayo Pitaya and defeat him, he's one or two fights away from becoming a homebody, a household name, I should say. He's right there. If you don't know who Chris Billam Smith, look him up, because he's a young fighter who possesses a lot of talent, well-rounded, similar to what Jayo Pitaya is, except Jayo Pitaya possesses a lot of power. So this would be a fun fight, a title fight at that, and Chris Billam Smith is definitely the biggest name and the absolute best test in that cruiserweight division, and Jayo Pitaya is asking for the very best out there. This would be an awesome fight to make. Jayo Pitaya against Chris Billam Smith, and it sits at number 9 on the list. At number 8, Dmitry Bivol versus Beterbiev or Callum Smith. Whichever one of those fighters comes out successful, we are a few days away from that fight taking place, and that's a fight that we're clamoring for. Dmitry Bivol against Beterbiev, of course, has been the fight that we've been calling for. That's taking on a similar trajectory to when Spence and Crawford was being clamored for years. It took 5 years to make that fight. Beterbiev and Bivol has been probably in the works for, or at least in the talks, and in people's mouths and minds for the last 2 years, if not more. And it's a fight that we should see, but of course Beterbiev has to get past Callum Smith. And that'll be a whole different episode. We'll go ahead and talk about that, whether it's a preview or recap episode, depending on how this week goes. But you'll definitely hear me cover that fight. That's a fight. That fight sits at number 8 on my list, and I think it's a necessary one. Of course, it's a dream fight, Dmitry Bivol against Beterbiev. But if Callum Smith pulls off the upset, yes, we want to see a big unification fight at light heavyweight, and then it would be a Bivol-Smith showdown. So that's why I have it slashed, because that fight hasn't happened yet, and we're a few days away from that fight taking place. So Bivol against Beterbiev or Smith, whoever comes out victorious this coming weekend, that fight sits at number 8 on the list. At number 7, I have Jermall Charlo versus Zanibek Elimkhanuli. Zanibek is your unified champ at 160. Lower on the list, I ended up mentioning Chris Eubanks trying to secure the WBA title by challenging Erislandy Lara. Well, Zanibek has 2 of the titles, and Jermall has the WBC title. Now that Jermall's back and he beat Jose Benavidez, this is a fight for him to make. All 3 titles, 3 of the 4 titles would be on the line. Jermall defends his title, his WBC title that the WBC Suleiman has been standing by and keeping him as champion, keeping that title with Jermall. he needs to get back and decide whether he's going to defend the title or not. I think it would be completely disrespectful if he just sheds the title after the WBC has stood by him for so long, as he's gone through his personal issues outside of the ring. The WBC has stood by him, and I think it would be the right thing for Jermall to come back and defend that title. If he defends the title against Carlos Adames, who is the mandatory challenger for Jermall, then that would be a great fight as well. And it would be a tough test for Jermall, because Carlos Adames is that good of an opponent and potentially 1 or 2 fights away from becoming a champion himself. But I really believe that the biggest fight to make right now at 160, which is lacking a little bit, I really believe that this is the biggest fight that Jermall could get in, and the big fight for Zanabek. And it would mean 3 of the 4 titles being on the line, and it would be a huge fight for the middleweight division. Jermall Charlo, Zanabek, Alim Kanuli sits at number 7 in my book. Number 6, we move down to 140. I put Teofimo Lopez against Subriel Matias. Subriel is calling out Devin Haney, calling out Ryan Garcia, calling out Teofimo Lopez, all the big names. He wants to smoke. And he is quickly becoming the boogeyman at 140 pounds. He's like a mini Tito Trinidad in my book. Subriel Matias is a champion at 140 pounds, and he is one that is not being talked about. Now that Ryan Garcia ended up pulling out of the negotiations with Devin Haney, that would be an awesome fight for Devin Haney, who just lifted the title from Regis Prograis in fairly easy fashion. This would be a legit fight for him to take on the so-called boogeyman of the 140-pound division that nobody even mentions, nobody talks about, and nobody's even considering. Subriel Matias and Devin Haney would probably be the best fight to make out there. But for me, and I'm saying that because Ryan Garcia pulled out of the Haney negotiations and is now seeking the Rolly Romero fight, and Rolly holds the WBA title at 140. So that ties up one champion. Teofimo Lopez just announced that he's going to be fighting Jermaine Ortiz, a former foe of Vasily Lomachenko. And he's a former foe of Teofimo Lopez in the amateurs. Back in 2015, they ended up facing each other in one of the amateur tournaments, in one of the finals, actually. So they know each other. There's a past between them, and they both possess very similar styles. Fast footwork, fast hands, stay on the outside. They have really wide stances, and it's basically I see this fight very similar to how we saw Teofimo and George Kambosos. Between Teofimo and Jermaine Ortiz is going to be it's going to be a tit for tat type of fight with a lot of point scoring, more so than traditional boxing. A lot of heavy punches, a lot of heavy leather, and a lot of looping punches in that fight, at least from how I'm analyzing the fight. That's going to happen Super Bowl weekend, Teofimo and Jermaine Ortiz. Nonetheless, later this year, should he be successful and defend his title, I would love to see Subriel Matias and Teofimo have a unification bout at 140 pounds. I have that fight at number 6 on my list. Teofimo, Subriel Matias, I think would be an absolute hell of a show, and it could definitely be a main event all on its own. Teofimo, Subriel Matias would be an awesome fight, and I don't know who I would favor on that one. It's that close of a fight for me in my book. Number 5, Jaron Boots Ennis. Boots versus Terence Crawford at 147 pounds. There is talks that Terence Crawford and Errol Spence have reached an agreement to fight the rematch once again. It looks like the fight is headed for 154 pounds rather than a welterweight fight. But no major details have been released. So again, the little bit that I know is possibly what you know as of right now. But Terence Crawford is a man at 147 pounds and relinquished one of the titles, which I believe is the IBF title that Boots has at the moment. He ended up getting it awarded. So he ended up getting it awarded, not winning it in the ring. And he is very vocal about wanting to fight Terrence Crawford and wanting to rightfully earn that title in the ring, and willing to put it up against Terrence Crawford, who became the man, the undisputed champ at 147 when he defeated Errol Spence, and became a monster and a legend in the way that he defeated and picked apart Errol Spence in that huge showdown last year, 2023. Boots Ennis, Terrence Crawford sits at number 5 for me. At number 4, Jermell Charlo versus Tim Tszyu at 154 pounds. Jermell lost the WBO title because the sanctioning body ended up stripping him of the title when he announced that he was going up to fight 2 divisions to fight Canelo Alvarez in what was a big, fun, fan-friendly type fight, a mega event at that in September. So the WBO lifts the title from him when Jermell happens to be the undisputed champ. WBO's like, nope, we're not going to let you keep being champion for us, and they put it on the line for Tim Tszyu and Brian Mendoza. Tim Tszyu came out successful, and he is the WBO champ. That fight needs to happen. Tim Tszyu is the absolute best 154-pounder next to Jermell Charlo. Jermell Charlo, of course, is your most recent undisputed champion. But Tim Tszyu's been taking on anybody and everybody at 154 and willing to do so. And that's the key. He's willing to get in those fights, and he's been calling out for Jermell for several years now. And now that he's basically been dismantling everybody else and picking apart everybody else and defeating them, who was a name at 154, he needs to get in there with Jermell Charlo, and that's the fight that we want to see at 154. I have that fight at number 4, Jermell against Tim Tszyu, for Jermell to regain his throne, a throne that he never lost, but they lifted a title from him. He needs to regain that throne at 154, and or at least show the world that he is the man. He doesn't have to prove anything, of course, but this is a fight game, and he is the man at 154, and Tim Tszyu would be the final piece should he decide to move up to 160 or just look for mega fights after that and relinquish all titles, because there's been talks with the back and forth between him and Terrence, of course, and so forth. Should he decide to do that, great. But I think this is the final fight, the final meaningful fight for him at 154 with title implications. And this would be a meaningful fight for him to defend the throne that rightfully belongs to him, that he earned when he defeated Brian Castaño on their second showdown. Jermell, Tim Tszyu sits at number 4. At number 3, I have the rematch between Amanda Serrano and Katie Taylor. More than likely, this will not be what Amanda Serrano wants, which would be a 12-round, a 3-minute round, 12-round championship fight. More than likely, she wouldn't get her way against Katie Taylor, and that would potentially destroy the negotiations. But I think Amanda Serrano would be just the fact that if the negotiations happened with Katie Taylor once again, she would be willing to do whatever she could just to secure that rematch and try to avenge her loss to Katie Taylor. Of course, this would mean that Amanda Serrano would have to travel because the last fight was at Madison Square Garden. So now it would be her turn to go more than likely to Ireland into enemy territory and fight Katie Taylor in her home turf. Now, I have that at number 3 because the first fight between these two women was a classic, and I would love for nothing more than to see Katie Taylor involved in 2 more fights before she hangs up the gloves. There's nobody else she needs to fight. I think it was a controversial win in her last outing against Chantel Cameron. I think that trilogy is going to happen between the two, where they split victories and they gave each other the first blemish of each of their respective resumes. So I think that trilogy needs to happen, and this match, the rematch with Amanda Serrano, that's why I put it at number 3. Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano 2 would be an absolute sellout, and it would be one of the biggest fights of this year should it come to fruition. At number 2, Devin Haney, Gervonta Davis. How likely is this fight to happen? Well, that's why I have it on a dream list, because it's not very likely that it's going to happen. It's not very likely that Gervonta and Leonard Ellerbe are going to negotiate this fight with Devin Haney. Devin Haney's campaigning at 140. Gervonta bounces between 135 and 140 and imposed a catch weight with Ryan Garcia. So the moment that he ends up wanting to be the biggest or wants to be the A side to the negotiations, where Devin Haney is the one with the title, but remember, Gervonta also holds versions of the WBA title, and the WBA just loves to have their titles around Gervonta because he's so marketable and such a household name and is a money fighter. Then negotiations would more than likely fall through because Gervonta would want to be the A side, and Devin and his dad would not give in to the demands of Gervonta Davis, meaning catch weights or rehydration clauses, purses. You know, the purse would be up for grabs, and of course it would favor Gervonta, who's had higher marketable, higher gate revenue career than that of Devin Haney, who is just coming into his own and becoming to be one of those big revenue fighters. Nonetheless, it's a dream list, and I have it that high on my list. Devin Haney, Gervonta Davis, I think would be one of the most meaningful fights to make, and one that all of us would just stop to be able to tune in and watch that fight to see what the outcome would be. Similar to how last year happened with Errol Spence and Terence Crawford. Every so often, these fights get made, and this is one of those fights that I think would be so meaningful for the sport of boxing. And last but not least, number 1, Saul Canelo Alvarez versus the Mexican monster, David Benavidez. Why am I putting this fight so high? Because I think that's it. I think this is, out of all the divisions, we have Tyson Fury and Usyk already signed, and it's going to be happening next month. We saw Terence Crawford and Errol Spence. I'm not looking forward to the rematch so much. I am and I'm not. I'm indifferent. I'm on the fence whether I really want to see that rematch or not, because Errol Spence has been having a lot of medical issues, and he doesn't need it anymore. But I know why he wants to do it, because of the way that fight went down. He wants to avenge and erase that memory from people's heads that he looked that way, that he performed in that fashion, that he got picked apart. So I get it. For his personal pride, his ego, his sanity, for his state of mind, he wants to avenge that. Terence Crawford is in a different state of mind. And he's at the point where he continues to want to conquer and wants to accomplish undisputed in another division. So he's been calling out Canelo to put all his titles, and he's willing to go up to 168 to face him. He wants to fight Jermell Charlo for the undisputed throne at 154, but that no longer could be completed because the WBO lifted one of the belts from Jermell. We just discussed this. But he still wants to become undisputed and be the first to accomplish it in 3 divisions. Whether it's him that does it or Naoya Inoue, if he ends up moving up to 126 and doing it, I think the pathway for Inoue is a lot more likely that he'll accomplish this in a 3rd division than Terence Crawford being able to do so. Saul Canelo Alvarez and David Benavidez is it. If you look at all the divisions, everybody else is either fighting one another or solving it. But I think that's it. That's the biggest fight to make that has not been announced, that is not in the works, that is nowhere near being negotiated. And it's what we were asking for with Usyk and the Gypsy King, and we're going to get that fight. So from there, the only biggest showdown it's got to be Canelo and Benavidez, and I have to put it at number 1. And I really believe, who knows? Time will tell, obviously, but I really believe in my heart that we're going to see it in September. For Canelo, it would probably be better sooner than later. Just get it out of the way and take the fight to Benavidez, because if he takes him in May and he's successful, I think the more that Benavidez gets under his belt, the stronger and better he's getting. And I think Canelo is better that he takes him next than if he takes him in September. But I really believe that Canelo's maybe 3 or so fights from hanging it up, and calling it a day and riding off into the sunset. And this is definitely one of those fights that must happen, that should happen, and one of those big generational fights. And I think it's the biggest fight, and therefore I put it at number 1 on this list. So with that said, here we go, another long episode. But this one, obviously, for obvious reasons, it was a big list. 48 fighters in all, 24 fights. And these are my 24 dream fights for 2024. I want to hear what you have to say. I want to know which fight you think I should have had on the list. Leave me a comment and shoot me a message on X, or leave me a comment on the post. That's the best way to reach me, is on the Instagram page. Look me up on Instagram, follow me so you could be on track whenever I'm posting the new episodes. And thank you. Thank you for continuing to download and for continuing to help the show grow. I tell you each and every episode, and I mean it from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, thank you, thank you for letting me accompany you, for letting me join you. These long episodes, I'll continue to be here, as long-winded as they are. I'll continue to be here as long as you continue to be there on the other end. So thank you so much. Have yourself a great night. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I want to hear what your list looks like. If it's very similar to mine, or if it's completely different, I want to know. And if there's a fight that I missed on this list, put it on the comments in the posting that corresponds to this episode, and then I'll reach back to you and I'll be like, yep, you completely right. I missed that one, so I should have had that one on here. So thank you again. Have yourselves a great night, and I'll catch you all on the next episode.